Good evening. I'm Earl Butch Graves, Jr., CEO of Black Enterprise, and it's my privilege to welcome you to the Black Enterprise C-Suite and Boardroom Equity Summit, a virtual event dedicated to the elevation of Black executive talent to the highest echelons of corporate leadership. Black Enterprise has long championed the rise of Black professionals who have fought for and earned their rightful place in the nation's boardroom and executive suites. For more than a half century, we've chartered the upward trajectories of America's most successful and influential Black executives, and you're going to meet a number of them tonight. Why should their ascension matter to you? Senior management teams drive strategic decisions on the internal and external direction of major companies, including its equity agenda. Their focus determines the growth and development of Black talent, the increase of procurement spend among Black vendors, including Black media, and the allocation of philanthropic dollars to Black organizations, communities, and causes. As for corporate boards, they hold a fiduciary responsibility to safeguard the financial health of major companies and maximize shareholder value. Moreover, their oversight of the CEO and senior management determines whether corporate practices align with core values impacting employees, managers, suppliers, customers, investors, and other stakeholders. So it is most fitting that we hold this summit as we release our 2022 Boardroom Power Report, which includes our exclusive BE registry of corporate directors. For the past decade, Black Enterprise has been the undisputed leader in the compilation and dissemination of data and analysis on the status of Black board representation at the largest publicly traded corporations. We have also served as the most vocal advocate urging corporate America to reconfigure the racial composition in corporate governance across the tech, finance, and industrial sectors. I'm equally proud that our research has been used by scores of organizations ranging from the Executive Leadership Council to the Congressional Black Caucus to address institutional barriers that hinder Black executives and entrepreneurs from gaining such prime positions. This full-throated activism, coupled with the current demands for meaningful corporate equity, have driven significant progress. Our report reveals that 85% of S&P 500 companies today have at least one Black corporate director versus just 60% in 2016, the first year we reported on board diversity across the entire index. Of note, since 2016, 100% of S&P 500 companies have embraced women representation on corporate boards. Despite this progress, only 12 African Americans hold positions as board chairs and lead directors. Overall change in corporate leadership and Black corporate leadership continues to be sluggish, tepid, and inconsistent. In fact, Black executives occupy a mere 3.2% of senior leadership roles at major companies, and less than 1% hold CEO positions. As a result of these developments, the series of corporate pledges announced 2 years ago to end systemic discrimination and provide real access to opportunities ring hollow, especially among young Black professionals like many of you. The Executive Leadership Council's Institute survey of Black professionals found that a stunning 16% left their jobs in 2021. The stated reasons for this great resignation are telling: career advancement, better compensation, difficulties with management, and a desire for a career change. The evidence is clear. Black professionals continue to be vexed by limited mobility and immovable obstacles to advancement. For too many, the perception remains that the doors to the C-suite and the boardroom remain closed. We are here to discuss the perception and the reality. As the #1 Black digital media brand with more than 12 million unique visitors per month, Black Enterprise is using our platform to address these issues. Prepare for a bold and frank conversations on what it takes for Black talent to succeed in corporate America in 2022 and beyond. We'll also explore efforts underway to groom the next generation of Black C-suite executives and board members. Finally, some of the most brilliant minds in corporate DEI will draft a real and sustainable action plan for Black corporate advancement. The bottom line always is equity. Our goal with this summit is to power your journey to the C-suite and within the boardroom. Welcome aboard and get ready for a very powerful evening. Before we start our program, I would like to take this time to extend my appreciation to our sponsors, Hasbro, Hyatt, Manulife John Hancock, Merck, and Nationwide for investing in this unique virtual summit. We want to kick things off with an in-depth conversation with a corporate powerhouse, Kenneth Frazier, the recently retired CEO and executive chairman of Merck & Company, who broke new ground as the first African-American to helm one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies. Under Ken's leadership, Merck delivered innovative, life-saving medicines and vaccines, as well as long-term and sustainable value to its multiple stakeholders. Ken increased Merck's investment in research and development while refocusing the organization on the launch and growth of key products that provide far-reaching benefits to society. An advocate for more effective DEI policies, Ken is one of the chief architects of OneTen, the innovative platform designed to enlist scores of major companies to hire 1 million Black workers without degrees over the next decade. Without a doubt, Ken ranks among the most successful and respected Black executives in the history of corporate America. Indeed, he's the consummate game changer. Please welcome my friend, Mr. Kenneth Frazier.
Thanks, Butch. Can I just thank you for having me here today? I'm really thrilled always to be with you, but in particular with your audience that comprises the next generation of Black leadership in corporate America.
Ken, thank you very much. I appreciate you taking the time. We're delighted to have you. And hey, you look great. This retirement seems to be working well for you.
So far, so good.
So far, so good. That's great. Ken, I wanted to start off and asking you to share with folks a little bit about your background, because I know it. You are a lawyer by training, but it's a very unique background that ultimately got you into the CEO position at Merck. But it would be great if you could share just a few minutes on your journey, how you got there, because you were a criminal defense attorney, actually, in Philadelphia, and ended up as the chairman and chief executive of Merck, which is not exactly a straight line. No. But it was very interesting, and I think it would be great for the audience to be able to hear a little bit about your background.
Okay, thanks, Butch. So let me start by saying, I think if anything, my background and experience shows that there is no set approach to get into the C-suite. If I got there, anybody can get there. So as Butch mentioned, I spent a number of years as a trial lawyer doing, among other things, death penalty work in the South, which isn't exactly relevant to the business of Merck. But because I needed to pay my mortgage, I couldn't just do that work, pro bono work. I had to represent a few for-profit companies that could pay the bills, and one of them happened to be Merck. And I did a lot of trial work for Merck in those days. And then around the early 1990s, when I'd been a partner in a law firm for about 8 years, I got a call from the CEO of Merck, a terrific man named Roy Vagelos, who called me and said he only had about 3 years left in his tenure, and he had an opportunity to make one more person's career. And he said, it's going to be your career. And I was very fortunate that he brought me into the company initially as a lawyer, but very soon after I arrived, he moved me out of the legal department. And I was a little surprised because I thought my contributions would be greater in the field that I understood. But right away, he said, no, you got to learn the business. I want to put you in the business. I want to make sure you learn the business. I think you can contribute beyond just being a lawyer. So that's a very important part of whatever happened to me, was that I had a great mentor and sponsor in the CEO. I had access to the kind of person who was in a position to make or break my career. And he moved me into the business. So I spent 30 years at Merck. only 7 in the legal department, the other 23 in the business. And the important thing is that I would never, ever have thought of myself as a business person had not that CEO had a vision for where my career could go. And so on my best day as CEO, in many ways, I'm simply imitating Roy Vagelos because I had access to him for the first 2.5 years of my career here.
Yeah, it is a fascinating story, but it does go to the point of having a sponsor versus a mentor.
Correct. They're two different things. Mentors are there to help you as you go along your journey to improve how you do your work, et cetera. They're very important. But sponsors are people, as I said, who are in a position to make or break your career, who can move you forward, and who take a stand for what you can actually contribute.
We're going to come back to the work that you're doing with OneTen, but I would be remiss in we have now released our report, our annual report that we do on diversity or Black African-American representation on corporate boards. And coinciding with that is what we see also in the C-suite itself. But let me start with corporate boards. You have been very intentional on making sure that there was representation on your own board, and you also sat on and continue to sit on other boards. What's the importance, beyond the obvious, of having embracing diversity on corporate boards?
Let me start by saying that corporate boards are obviously in a position to decide the priorities and the approaches of companies. And, you know, it's interesting that following the whole George Floyd thing, a lot of companies made statements about racial justice and inequity and committing to things. And that's great that they're prioritizing those things. But the key question is results and accountability. And the reason representation on the board is important is because the board ultimately holds management accountable for achieving the most important goals of the company. That's how we get compensated. That's how we move forward. So that's the importance of the boards. And then obviously in senior management, it's really critical to have minorities, women, and I'm going to be specific, African Americans represented in senior management. You know, there was an interesting study done by LinkedIn that said that when you look at how people get promoted to boards or to senior management, what happens in the first step is people assemble a group of candidates who meet the standards, the criteria for the position, board or senior management. But interestingly enough, when the selection from within that group is made, it is generally made on the basis of relationships or networks. So my view of the world is until we have representation in the highest echelons of corporate America, young aspiring African Americans will be at a disadvantage because they don't have the same social networks that many other people have. And to me, that's why I've been, to use your word, intentional about ensuring that there was representation both at the board level at Merck, also in the senior management level.
Yeah, it strikes me, Ken, as I sit on a corporate board, understanding that we have, you know, my father, you said to me, he said, Butch, please understand, when I was put on the corporate board, he said, they didn't run out of smart white people to put on boards. So they put you on the board for you to represent us and to advocate on behalf of us, because so that others that come behind you will have an opportunity and a chance. But what I find is striking is that as we have measured board enhancement and change, right, from what was literally just in 2016, if you think about how crazy this is, just 6 years ago, only 60% of the S&P 500 companies thought that it was important to have an African-American sitting on the board. Today, it's 85%, so there has been change. And some of it coming off the, I'm not going to call it total corporate guilt, but what happened with 2 years ago with George Floyd, and intentionally beginning to focus on it. But as much as we've seen advancement in corporate boards, we have seen a slippage in the C-suite.
Yes.
And so while that has helped the few that have entered into sitting on corporate boards at its rawest level in regards to C-suite representation, or just take the number of Black CEOs. When you became the CEO back in 2011 of Merck, there were a number of Black CEOs. Not a great number, but a number of, and that number has actually gone down in those 11 years, if you will, or 11 or 12 years that it has been. So what is happening in corporate America, or what needs to, one, what is happening, and two, potentially, the B part of that question, what do you think has to happen in order to change this slippage of African-American talent actually making it into the C-suite on some level?
So obviously there are different issues based on what companies you're talking about, but let me just make some general comments. I believe that African-Americans still have to overcome being a part of a disfavored group. And that's at all levels of corporate America. I saw that in the practice of law before I came to corporate America. So there's a reluctance to hire out of the group. Now, individuals can overcome that reluctance. I often say my dad, you talked about your dad, by the way, let me just simply say that your dad was an icon. We lost people like him and Vernon Jordan, who young guys like me used to look up to. And because they were in the boardroom, I thought, well, maybe one day I could be there. So I just wanted to make that point. But the simple fact of the matter is, for African Americans, the absence of people, critical mass of African Americans on boards has led to many of these people not having sponsors or being overlooked. I think it's great for companies to make statements about racial equity, but the proof is in the pudding. And so for me, the fundamental issue is not just looking at who gets promoted to CEO, because that's the last step of a journey for everybody. The question is, what's happening at all levels of the company? Are people being held accountable for outcomes? I think Melody Hobson says it very well. She says diversity and inclusion is the only thing in corporate America where people get an E for effort. Everything else, people are held accountable for outcomes. They're held accountable for numbers. This is the one area where people shy away from that. So I think what's really important is two things. First of all, data matters. At the end of the day, everything that matters inside Merck, we actually measure and hold people accountable for reaching their numbers. So we need accountability around data that requires transparency in the first place, because if the board and senior management are not looking at the data on a regular basis, they can't figure out why people are not coming through the system. And you said at your outset, there's a huge amount of people who are leaving these jobs way before they become eligible to be in the C-suite. These companies have to diagnose what's happening in their environment such that they're losing so much African-American executive talent. And so they have to be transparent, they have to be accountable, and then they have to really ask themselves the hard questions. Because if they're actually losing more African-Americans than others, then there's something in the environment that they need to attend to.
Now, I want to borrow on another thing my father used to say to me. He said, Black executives, Butch, have to be willing to walk in harm's way. Mm-hmm. It's not enough to just get a position and you're fine, but you got to be willing to walk in harm's way. And one of the things I must say, Ken, that I and a lot of other Black executives, Black people, were proud of is when you were willing to walk in harm's way during the Trump administration, when you were, and I don't want to get the name wrong, but you were serving on
his business council.
The business council, right. And after what happened in Charlottesville, Virginia, you spoke up and spoke out and resigned from it. Talk to us a little bit about, that period of time, which was, you endured a lot of criticism, but you stood tall on your points, and people respected you. And not only did you do it, but you started a wave, quite honestly, of hundreds of people, both executives in corporate America as well as people outside of it, signing on to running an ad and all the above. But take us through that time frame and what happened and why you decided that I have to step up.
So let me start by saying that when I joined the President's Business Council, it took me a long time to decide that I was willing to do it. It was early in the Trump administration. You know, he kept saying, I want someone to represent your industry here, and Merck is a leader in the industry. I'm saying that I wasn't eager to be in that room for lots of reasons.
Right.
But I finally decided that it was important for the company and the industry for me to be in the room. And I was down there maybe 2 or 3 times, and every time I was seated right next to the president. I say that because there were pictures of those meetings, and my 2 kids, both of whom are grown, would call me up and they say, Dad, you're killing us. We all know, everybody knows you're our father, and you're making us pariahs. So
Right.
I'm making the point that going into the room was not without its challenges.
Right.
But after Charlottesville, when the statements were made, and the president, you know, basically could not find the fortitude to criticize what was happening in the streets with Nazis and Klansmen carrying torches and banners, etc., I knew I had to step down. One of my heroes is Frederick Douglass, and Frederick Douglass says in his autobiography that he had to learn pragmatism. He had to learn to sit with President Lincoln, even though things were not being said and done fast enough. He said, I needed to be in the room. So I believed that I needed to be in the room. But when President Trump made his statement, it was absolutely clear that I owed it to my family. I owed it to myself and my own sense of integrity. I owed it to a broader community that I represented to say this is not acceptable. And so it was very clear to me that I had an obligation to stand up against those comments that he made. The question then was whether I would be speaking as a matter of my own personal conscience and conviction, or was I going to be speaking on behalf of the company? So I asked my board over that weekend. I called them up and I said, look, I'm stepping off the council, all right? I'm not asking for any permission for that, right? But I'm asking you, should I be speaking as an individual, or do you want me to speak to the company's values? And I'm very pleased that my board unanimously said, no, actually, we want you to speak to the company's values. We don't want you simply to say as an individual, as a Black American, you stand against intolerance and extremism. We want to make a position as a company that we stand for diversity, that we stand against extremism and intolerance. And so that was what led to it. I have to say one quick story. You know, my youngest son, James, was a senior in college at that time, and he didn't come home a lot. He went to Lehigh University, which is not far from us. But when those statements were made, my son came home that Saturday night, and he was waiting for us when we came in from being out somewhere. I don't remember where we were, but he stood up and he said to me, Dad, what's up? What's up? And that's what passes for searing inquiry from a 21-year-old.
Right.
But what he was really saying is, you've told us through the years that we need to have principles and we need to stand for our values. He wanted me to know we're watching now, because the whole world will see you if you step up, but we'll see you if you don't step up.
Yeah, well, that's you know, that actually puts things into perspective, because when, you know, sitting as a CEO of a company with thousands of employees and other things, but when your own child looks you in the eyes and says, now, are you going to be courageous enough to do what you've been telling us to do? That puts a different spin altogether on, you know, how you respond.
So, Butch, I will say, people say it was courageous. It would have taken more courage for me not to step down, because the people I love and care about, my wife, right, my children, were waiting to see if I was really the person that they hoped that I would be in that moment.
You had to have been, I mean, the response from others was overwhelming, overwhelmingly positive, but the fact that others signed on. Talk a little bit about, you know, what you did and others to get other people to sign on and to literally to buy ads in newspapers to show, here's what we're saying, we will not stand, intolerance will not be accepted.
Yeah. So the most recent example of what you're talking about is that, you know, after the Georgia law, for example, was passed on voting rights, I got a call from my good friend, Ken Chenault. By the way, speaking of mentors, Ken Chenault, who was the former great chairman and CEO of American Express, when I came over to the business side, he always looked after me, and he was a great mentor of mine. But he and several other people, we all got together to actually say, as Black leaders of business, are we going to take a position or take a stand with respect to the ability of people to vote? Because you might remember that Georgia law was passed, and it actually constrained the ability of eligible voters to vote in some instances.
Right.
So we decided that we needed to take a stand. In the first instance, we got a bunch of African-American business leaders to put an ad in the paper, basically saying that as Americans, the right to vote is fundamental to our democracy. And as business leaders, things like the impartial, consistent application of the rule of law, protection of the franchise, protection of ownership, property ownership, those are the things that make American business work. And if we can't protect the fundamentals of democracy, then that's harmful to business. And that's the position that we took. We put that ad, it got a lot of attention. And then we sat around and said, now, wait a minute, that franchise has been historically deprived. Black people have been historically deprived of the right to vote, but every American should be standing for the right to vote. They should all be standing for the proposition that eligible voters should be able to vote without interference. So we said, look, we should ask all the CEOs to sign up. And so we began making calls to many CEOs. I can tell you, there were many CEOs in majority companies and majority CEOs who did not want to sign that initially. And why? Because as you see now with the whole ESG movement, there's a backlash now. There's a clear backlash, I will say, from the political right, the Republican Party. And some of them were very nervous about putting out what I consider to be a very basic statement about the right to vote in this country. But fortunately, we ended up getting about 700 business leaders to sign a full-page ad that was running in major newspapers, including the USA Today and the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. And I think that was a watershed for corporate America to stand up for the right to vote. And by the way, that right to vote is still under attack, as you know, all around this country.
No question. No question. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens in this coming November, and then ultimately what happens in 2024. But, it's kind of like I describe it as like being on remember the movie, The Poseidon Adventure? And
yes,
the guy looks out of the window and he sees the tidal wave coming, right? The wave is coming.
It is.
Regardless, right? So you can try to slow it down a little bit or what have you, but the reality is, or as I said to CEO of a board I served on, I said, Black and brown people are here to stay, right? Mm-hmm. So as much as we try to work our way around different things and everything that we do, that as you said, Melody Hobson, our good friend, has said that when it comes to DE&I, it seems like, an E for effort is good enough without a measurement. Ultimately, you're going to need all of these employees and workers because the sheer demographics dictate that we will have to be utilized. And so the sooner that you embrace us, the sooner that you benefit, right? And it's shown that those companies that have truly embraced diversity across all things have done much better.
Absolutely the case.
Love to pivot for a moment to OneTen. And I think probably hasn't been given as much publicity as it needs to be, I think. But one of the most important initiatives, I think, towards addressing with a real world, opportunity, not just a theory, but the ability to execute on something. That's important and a bold initiative, right? He said, we're going to hire 1 million Black people, right? Over the next—
Without 4-year degrees.
Without 4-year degrees to come to work, because that club you referred to in regards to folks that are working in corporate America, that if you're not in the club, and the club oftentimes are the people that you interact with or the people you went to college with, and so that's your network and what have you. And if you're not a part of it, somehow or another you're left out. Mm-hmm. But share with us, if you would, what is OneTen? Tell us about what the bold initiative of it and the progress you see that has happened already since you started this. You were one of the architects of, yes.
So OneTen was one of the things that came out of the corporate response to the George Floyd murder. And following that murder, companies started asking, well, what can we do to create more racial equity? And some of us who are in those discussions, myself, Ken Chenault, Charles Phillips, Kevin Sherrard, Ginny Remedia, formerly of IBM, we said, you know what corporations can do more than making statements or giving donation? What's in our wheelhouse is to hire people. So let me give you a couple of data points. The average African-American family has wealth of 1/10 of what the average white family has. And in the 2020 census, what we found was that 76% of African-Americans do not have a 4-year degree. And so when companies have a 4-year degree requirement for jobs that frankly should be skills-based, not degree or credentials-based, whether they intend to or not, they are limiting or excluding 3 out of 4 African Americans from having access to family-sustaining wage jobs. So what we ask these companies to do, and we now have 70 large companies in the OneTen coalition, is to reduce over time the number of jobs that require a 4-year degree by 50%, and to pledge to hire over the next 10 years 1 million African Americans who do not have 4-year degrees, and this is important, into family-sustaining wage jobs and careers. We're not talking about lower wage jobs. We're talking about jobs that are the gateway to the middle class. And the thesis behind OneTen, there are a lot of organizations, community colleges, workforce development organizations that have been training this population. But the problem, Butch, is that the companies have not given sustained demand for this population. So the organizations that train this population tend to be fragmented and subscale. What we're trying to do is hire these people at scale. So we need the demand to be at scale, because that can help develop on the supply side, supply at scale. So last year we hired about 25,000 people. We're off to a reasonable start. This year, our goal is 100,000 people. That's a big jump from 25,000 people.
Right.
We are probably headed more towards 60,000 right now. So we're not happy with the pace of progress, but we're committed to it. And so far, the companies have remained committed to it. We're hoping to make a big change, because I'll just say, you know, I'm the son of a janitor who had a 3rd grade education, and I was raised by a single parent father because my mother died when I was very young. The thing that stays in the back of my mind is every morning when I got up to go to school, I followed my father into the bathroom of our very small house. And the enduring memory I have of my childhood is the smell of my father's shaving cream every morning, because he got up every morning, shaved, dressed, went down those stairs, had a job. So he had dignity, he held his head high, he took care of his family. And I believe one of the most important things for young African-American children is for us to get beyond a system where people are dependent on public funds and can have the same kind of job and dignity and sense of self-worth. I think that will actually be important for the challenge of dealing with the intergenerational poverty that plagues our community and goes all the way back to slavery, et cetera.
You know, it's a tremendous initiative you guys are undertaking, and really gets at the root. You know, it's a startling statistic, because understanding that 76% of African Americans do not hold a 4-year degree, and that becomes the basis point for employment in many jobs, which really don't require that, right? You don't
Absolutely
need that to have it, is startling. But you also touched on a point having to do with Black wealth or wealth building, which is something that's been, you know, has been at the centerpiece of what Black Enterprise stands for, and differentiating wealth from income, right?
Right.
Because wealth is actually something that can be transferred to the next generation. Income is a utilization that is eaten up by your everyday things that you do. talk a little bit about how we push folks all the time on differentiating wealth from income, and how, and the statistic you use as, the average income, the average wealth of a Black family is 1/10 of that of a white family, which in and of itself puts them behind the 8 ball. But how do we teach our folks about, especially young folks, about the need to save and invest, to own a home, right?
Right.
White home ownership, 76%, Black home ownership, 47% in this country. That wealth building or wealth transfer, talk a little bit about, how you saw it, because it's interesting coming, as you said, sharing with us your background, where you saw how wealth changes one's life and one's path towards being successful.
So I think, there are two sides to this wealth equation. The first one is making sure that these companies, these banks and others, are providing capital for Black entrepreneurs and Black businesses, because ownership of those businesses, just like ownership of real estate, is a means to transfer intergenerational wealth, right? So I just don't want to miss that. I mean, the work that Les Brun and Melody Hobson and others are doing around Robert Smith and others to ensure that capital is made available to Black businesses and entrepreneurs is important. But the other issue around saving that you talked about is a really critical one. And it really ought to be taught in the schools. Because, I think back again to my dad, who had a 3rd grade education. Somehow along the way, he understood the need to save and to own the house that he lived in. My paternal grandfather was born in 1857, so he was born into slavery. My father was the first person in his lineage to actually own a property, right? It was a very humble house in the inner city of Philadelphia, but it was important to him that he owned it, that he paid off his mortgage. And he made those points to us about the importance of saving and the importance to thinking about wealth in the long term, not just about making sure you had the most fancy car or in my case, the best pair of sneakers when I was growing up. I would spend all my money on sneakers. But his whole thing was, no, you need to put money away so that you can save it for the things that are really going to matter in the long run. I don't know the answer to your question about how we do it, but as African Americans in the business community, it's important for each one of us and each person on this call to realize that they have a sphere of influence around them, that they can actually do something to help people in their own community realize the importance of wealth building.
Ken, you have been very, very generous with your time. I want to just end on one last thing, and you had just touched on a second ago, and that had to do with corporate America making a commitment towards Black-owned businesses.
Yes.
And I think as much as we try to solve, we're trying to solve employment, we're trying to solve, and that issue, things like OneTen and other are addressing that. The sitting in boardrooms, while that has improved, but what has really still not been able to be tackled is the commitment from corporate America to invest in Black-owned businesses, because true wealth is not earned, for the most part, working for somebody else.
Right.
True wealth is owning a business, like owning a home, and being able to move towards that. What do you think are some of the things that, or how we could get to making sure that procurement, right, is invested in the very communities upon which many of these corporations make money, right? They're making money off of the same Black and brown people, but not reinvesting their earnings back into those businesses. What do you think is an opportunity, a potential opportunity there?
So I think, once again, like the issues around employment and advancement in corporate America, the key is, do you have the commitment at the top? Does it come from the board? Does it come from the C-suite? And you use the word procurement. One of the things that I've tried to stress at Merck is that we want to go beyond procuring basic services and goods from vendors. What we also want to have are sustainable partnerships with Black organizations. So, for example, money managers, and others who run those kinds of businesses, right? We want to ensure that African Americans who run those kinds of businesses participate, because we've tended to think about this as a pure procurement thing, and that tends to get, frankly, at least in my experience at Merck, that tends to involve vendors, and those are more transactional relationships. I want to make sure that the fledgling Black investment banks, the Black tech firms, Black real estate firms, even Black lawyers are participating in the opportunities to build their businesses with customers like Merck. And I've seen a lot of companies, particularly the banks, Bank of America, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and others have been making commitments. But I haven't seen a lot of data about how much actual work is being done in that area. So it comes back to where we started in this. It's a great thing to make laudatory statements, but accountability is what's important. And as we're watching the wave come back against the progress that has been made over the last few years, I think it's more important than ever to hold those who say they want to do the right thing accountable for actually doing the right thing.
No question about it. When asked today, people ask me, what is your job? I said, well, I'm not the CEO of Black Enterprise. I'm the Chief Accountability Officer to corporate America, because I want to hold corporate America accountable to their pledges, right? It was very easy to speak and say, we're going to commit $500 million to fight racial equity or to sustain. And I said, well, what does that actually mean, right? I mean, we have to see investment in our businesses. And there are initiatives here and there that are making some progress at the margins, but we all have to see a greater number of people, of us, participating in this wealth creation that this country offers and promises, so that it impacts all of its citizens, and especially African Americans in particular. Well, Ken, and I want to say on behalf of Black Enterprise, on behalf of the Graves family, and on behalf of African Americans as a whole, we thank you for your really bold leadership, terrific leadership at Merck, as a shareholder of Merck, as a friend of yours, all the above. We could not be prouder of you, and I really appreciate you taking the time to share with us in this virtual summit and share your wisdom with our audience.
Butch, can I close with two comments? First of all, I want to thank you and your colleagues at Black Enterprise for doing what you do to ensure that there is visibility and accountability around the issues that we've been talking about. And the second I want to say directly to the audience here is that it's really critical for you to believe in yourselves. The reality of the world is young people grew up in a society that pretends to be, in effect, race neutral on a lot of things, or post-racial. There's nothing farther from the truth. And it's important for you to work around and with people who sustain you, because you're going to run into barriers in your career. And I feel very fortunate that throughout my life, starting at the church level when I was a little boy, and then going through many mentors that had people who actually reminded me that I could be much more than I felt like I could be in the moment. So believe in yourselves. I know you're going to be successful, and I've had a pleasure being here and an honor to be talking to you today.
Thank you, Ken.